To Zoom. Okay. All right. So this is a new working paper on the rise of Vietnam solar panel manufacturing. It's joint work with Meng, who's here as a PhD student of mine at King's, and who will be joining the WTO in January as a young professional, and also with Trang and Gaurav, who are at the World Bank and the IFC. Okay, so we start with why a paper on solar panel. Well, solar energy is the future of electricity generation. So this is a graph from the International Energy Agency that shows that in both 2023 and 2024, so the light blue and the dark blue bars, solar energy is the biggest part of new electricity generation, new installations. So it dominates renewable energy, it dominates even non-renewable energy sources. It is, you can think of it as the future of electricity generation. It's big business. So it's big business. Why is that? Because it's a central part of the fight against climate change or climate change mitigation. It's also important for the green growth, the green transition. Some people will say it's important for energy security. And another stylized fact is that its production has been dominated by China. So there's a paper, a same report by the International Energy Association, the IEA, suggests that China dominates 80% of solar panel manufacturing worldwide. Yeah, so that's the final stages of solar panels themselves, but also over the whole supply chain. It dominates 80% of all that, from raw materials, parts and components, to assembled solar panels. Another one way in which China achieved that, according to a paper by Banagas Sanchez, is by industrial policy. A lot of subsidies, consumer subsidies, producer subsidies has allowed Chinese manufacturing of solar panels to grow very fast in the last 20 years. At the same time, it's a green technology, and that is one reason why it is heavily affected or targeted by industrial policy. So a recent paper that has looked at which sectors, which countries do industrial policy suggests that in rich countries, green energy is one of the main reasons why countries do industrial policy. So solar panels are heavily affected by this. In China, they've been important in helping the country get where it's at in terms of dominating solar panel manufacturing. And it's also affected heavily by trade policy. So even before the US-China trade war, solar panels were targeted by tariffs, anti-dumping tariffs, especially by the US and the EU against China. And those tariffs, those anti-dumping tariffs, are one reason why maybe Vietnam emerged as an important origin country for or production hub for solar panels. So this graph shows US imports of solar panels and where are they from? So you see that from 2010 to 2018, China and Malaysia dominated the exports of solar panels to the US. And then something changed in 2018. You see Vietnam emerging as one country, as a main production hub for solar panel. In 2022, it accounted for about 9% of world exports of solar panel. So the question we try to answer in this paper is, how did Vietnam get there? How did Vietnam achieve this? And more precisely, what is the role of foreign inputs or foreign parts and components, the role of FDI, the role of subsidies, and how global value chain linkages have shaped the rise of Vietnam's solar panel industry. Okay, so we answer these questions in 4 steps. Okay, the first step is to identify the firms making or selling solar panels in Vietnam. We do that using data on sales of solar panels at the firm product level. And we have data from 2018 to 2023. As a second step, we try to trace the value chain. Okay, so not just solar panels themselves, but all the parts and components and raw materials that are used by solar panel firms. Okay, so to do that, we compile a new list. Okay, we're going to combine two existing lists to try to get a comprehensive uh, list of all the inputs used to make solar panels. And then we're going to look at imports or shipments of those inputs using firm-to-firm transaction data. As a third step, we try to see whether the subsidies play a role in the rise of Vietnam's solar panel exports. And we're going to do that using data from Global Trade Alert. And as a final step, step 4, we're going to examine upstream spillovers or backward linkages. Okay, so did the rise of solar panel firms in Vietnam create a lot of jobs? Did it create a lot of jobs in domestic local suppliers, so firms supplying inputs to solar panel makers? Did it create productivity linkages across the value chain? Okay, so I'll go for the rest of the presentation. I'll proceed step by step along those 4 steps. Okay, so step 1, identify solar panel firms in Vietnam. So to do that, we use 2 data sets. The first one is a data set we call Panjiva, that is called Panjiva. Okay, it's from a branch of S&P Capital, and it provides customs transaction level data. And this data provides us with product and firm IDs. So it looks like this, where you have a firm that is identified by an exporter tax ID. You have the date of the transaction, the shipment destination, and the HS code. So the HS code is at the 8-digit level and allows us to identify firms that are selling or shipping solar panels. So we focus on firms that ship both assembled and unassembled solar panels, so 2 8-digit product codes. What's interesting about this data set is that it includes international shipments from Vietnam, both imports and exports. But because a lot of the manufacturing process of solar panels in Vietnam takes place in special economic zones, transactions have to clear customs. So this data set ends up covering almost the universe of global of solar panel manufacturing in Vietnam. And we use a second data set, which is the Vietnam Enterprise Survey that comes from the Government Statistical Office. So I guess many of you here have used this data before. So it's firm level data that covers the almost the universe of Vietnam firms. And we're able to match the 2 data sets using the tax IDs of the firms. And this allows us to have a lot more information, a lot more variables on those firms, like whether the total sales, the number of employees, whether the firm is foreign owned or not. The one thing is missing is where is the capital from? If the firm is an FDI firm, we don't know from in the VES data, the Vietnam Enterprise Survey, if the where the what is the source of the FDI. So to get that information, or to identify the source of FDI, we looked up manually the tax ideas in online directories. Okay. And these online directories, they provide a crucial piece of information, which is who is the firm's legal representative. And this is a legal requirement in Vietnam. Each of the foreign firms need to have one person, one contact person, that is most of the time from the same country of origin as the capital, as the FDI. And so using that information allowed us to come up with a systematic, and we found out pretty accurate way to measure the origin or to find out what is the origin of the capital of the FDI firm. All right, so this is one example of the online directories that we used to identify the source of capital. So we Google, we have a tax ID, we have a company name, and what is circled in red here is who is the legal representative. And so this is the company called Vina Union that makes solar panels in Vietnam, and it tells us that the legal representative is from South Korea. So we use that information to identify the origin country of the FDI firms. Okay, we did a lot of checking, some Google searches as well, to make sure that our classification was accurate. So doing all this with these two data sets and these online directories gives us this picture. And so we have in 2022, 79 firms in Vietnam that are selling solar panels. Okay, so this is the graph on the left with the number of firms. It has been growing from about 50 in 2018 to 79 in 2022. About half of those firms are FDI firms. Um, and so 25 out of 79 are Chinese FDI firms. Yeah, so Chinese FDI accounts for a big part of the total number of firms making solar panels in Vietnam. But then if you look at employment and exports, you see that it's even more dominated by FDI firms and especially by Chinese FDI firms. Okay, so Chinese FDI accounts for about 50% in 2022, 50% of employment by solar uh, firms in Vietnam, and almost 75% of the export value. So this, I mentioned before that trade policy anti-dumping in the US and in the EU was maybe one reason why uh, Vietnam emerged as a production hub. This is also something that is investigated in the paper by Monty, and she suggests that one of the reasons you have solar panel FDI and Chinese FDI in Vietnam is because of those anti-dumping tariffs. Okay, so we do find confirmed that you have a large share of solar panel exports from Vietnam that is done by Chinese FDI firms. And then just to have a quick look at whether those FDI firms are different in any way from domestic-owned solar firms in Vietnam, we compare them across a few characteristics, whether we look at FDI versus Vietnam firms or Chinese FDI versus Vietnam firms. And what we found is that FDI firms are bigger, both in terms of sales and in terms of employees. But when we look at other characteristics, they seem to be very similar. They're similar in terms of the average wage they pay, in terms of labor productivity, in terms of how many shares foreign inputs they use, and whether they use Chinese foreign inputs or not, they're very similar across these dimensions. So they're bigger firms, but similar otherwise. Okay, so this is what we do in the first step. We try to see which are the firms producing solar panels in Vietnam, and we find that Chinese FDI accounts for many of the firms and especially for a large share of exports. The second step is to trace the value chain. So which are the parts and components and the raw materials that are used in the production of solar panels? So here you have a very basic picture that shows it starts with silicone, and then you make ingots with them, then you slice them to make wafers that finally become assembled into solar cells. There's a lot more parts and components involved in this, and to identify what are those parts and components, we use, again, two data sets. And the first one is from Fetzer and co-author. And what they did here is for all the products that exist at the 6-digit level, they computed these input-output linkages using AI. And they have this website that they allow researchers to use to look at all the inputs for any products that you want. So we use that website and focused on solar panels and identified 70 HS 6-digit products, inputs that are used or linked to the making of solar panels. The second data set comes from a paper from last year from Rosno and Mealy, who also compiled a list of solar panel parts and components from raw materials like copper ores, silver ores, and silicone to more finished parts and components like safety glass or optical devices. And they come up, so they did that by doing a literature review, by looking through industry reports and talking to experts to validate their list. And they came up with, let's see how many. They came up with I don't have the, can't see the number here, but also about, if I remember well, 107 um, HS digit products. So we compiled those two lists to come up with a comprehensive understanding of all the inputs and parts and components, raw materials that are used in the productions of solar panels. And we include that list, so we end up with 161 six-digit products, and we include that list in the appendix of our paper, making it clear whether it comes from the Rosner and Mealy paper or from the Fetzer AI list, or whether the product is found in both lists. Okay, so this gives us a good comprehensive idea of all the parts and components that are used in the making of solar panels. And then we look for transaction data, all the shipments, all the imports of those 161 inputs by firms selling solar panels in Vietnam. And we have that information from the Panjiva data. And again, it includes domestic transactions as well. So if a solar panel manufacturing firm in Vietnam buys inputs from a firm based in Vietnam in a special economic zones, we will have that data in our data set. Okay, so it's the Panjiva firm-to-firm transaction data that allows us to look at all the imports of these parts and components. So if we have a quick look at that data set, what does it reveal? It reveals that the most or the biggest share of those inputs comes from China. The imports have been growing since 2019, and these are the five top countries. So you have China, Japan, South Korea, the US, and Vietnam. And you see that China dwarfs pretty much everything else, but also that Vietnam has been growing as a supplier of parts and components to solar panel making firms. Okay. So this is total imports of parts and components. We can also look at the number of firms selling parts and components to Vietnamese solar panel makers. And you see that in 2022, there's almost 800 firms based in China that supply parts and components to make solar panels in Vietnam. And here you see also more than 100 Japanese firms, South Korean firms, US firms, and a large 400 local suppliers. So from China, overall, you have almost 800 firms in 2022 supplying more than 100 different HS6 products to Vietnamese solar panel manufacturers. If we zoom in into those, let's say, the 9 most important inputs to make solar panels. So you have tempered safety glass, you have uncast aluminum, you have silicone, chemical elements. So the first row is 2019, the second row is 2023. You see the share of China is really high across a number of those top 9 inputs, the share in red. So China dominates the supply of those inputs to Vietnam. But what is also interesting here is that you see the share of Vietnam increasing from 2019 to 2023. You see that the orange part, if you go down one row, you see that the orange part, the share of the pie gets bigger in 2023, which suggests backward linkages or the role of Vietnam, the domestic value added increasing in Vietnam. Okay, step 3. So we've looked at who makes solar panels in Vietnam, who are the firms, there's Chinese FDI. Where does the inputs come from? Mostly from China, but Vietnam is becoming a more important source over time. And now the third step is to identify the role of subsidies. So why are we interested in the role of subsidies? Well, because we know that anti-dumping tariffs, the US-China trade war probably played a role. So why China no longer itself dominates exports of solar panels, but Vietnam, rose because of those panels, a form of trade diversion. But we know less about the role of subsidy. And why it's interesting here is because subsidies may take place across the supply chain. In the production of raw materials and the productions of parts and components, might not just affect the final product. And so we can investigate the role of subsidies across the supply chain. We know that from previous papers that subsidies do boost exports. We know that subsidies were instrumental in the rise of solar panel firms in China, like local subsidies, both consumer and producer subsidies. And we know that from a paper by Banares, Sanchez, and co-authors. But we don't really know about the role of subsidies in solar panel manufacturing in Vietnam. So to investigate this, we use data from Global Trade Alert, which is publicly available data. So it sees itself as the World Trade and Industrial Policy Watchdog. And so what it does, it scrapes the web every day, all the time, for news about policies that affect trade or industrial policy generally. And what does it tell us? It tells us that, well, solar panels and their inputs on the whole value chain has been heavily affected by subsidies, according to Global Trade Alert. The red line here tells us that, okay, so this is cumulative number of reported subsidies. So in 2022, we have more than 3,000 reported subsidies on solar panels and their inputs in China. It's also really high in the EU, including the UK. It's also high in the US. It's a sector, according to Global Trade Alert, that is heavily affected by subsidies. What about Vietnam? So according to Global Trade Alert, no subsidies across the solar panel value chain in Vietnam. Okay, but we know that production takes place in special economic zones. Okay, so it's not specific to solar panels, but in special economic zones, you can benefit from preferential import tariffs, preferential taxes, and things like that, which can be seen as a form of subsidy as well, or industrial policy. But to investigate instead the role of subsidies themselves, for which we have data on, we're going to look whether the inputs used to make solar panels in Vietnam are subsidized in the country of origins of those inputs. And this is summarized in this graph. So it tells us the number of products or inputs that are imported from every country to make solar panels in Vietnam. And what is the share of those products that is covered by subsidies in the origin country? Okay, so from China, Vietnam imports around 100 inputs, and all of them, or 99% of them, are covered by subsidies, according to GTA. Then it imports also more than 60 products from Vietnam, imports, but sources domestically 60 products, and none of them are covered by subsidy, according to Global Trade Alert. From South Korea, almost 50 products, almost half of which are subsidized. From the US, mostly subsidized products, etc. Okay, so you have differences across countries of whether the parts and components that are supplied to Vietnam's solar panels, whether they're subsidized or not at home. And so to understand a little bit better how this affects solar panels in Vietnam, we're going to look at whether subsidies affect the prices of those parts and components or those inputs. And so the Panjiva data also gives us unit prices. So we know the individual price of all of those inputs. So we're going to run these regressions or estimate these regressions, trying to see if inputs that are sourced from countries that subsidize them are cheaper, have lower prices. So on the left-hand side, we have the product or in logs of product I, which is defined at the 8-digit level, imported by firm J from source country O in year T. And our variable of interest is whether the product I from country O in year T has been subsidized or not. So it's this panel with fixed effects. We're going to use product time fixed effects and firm fixed effect. So the same firm will import ingots from Malaysia and from South Korea. Only Malaysia subsidizes it, is it cheaper from Malaysia than from South Korea? Okay, for example. So within firm, the same product, is it cheaper if it comes from a country that subsidizes it? So we estimate this regression, and what we found that on average, yes, if the inputs are from subsidy countries, they're 27 to 32% cheaper. And we also estimate this over year by year to see if it changes over time. And the answer is not really, but there's a clear picture that if the products come from a country that subsidizes them, they're cheaper. This is what the red dots tell us. If they come from China compared to other countries, they're also significantly cheaper. This is what the green square tells us, and this is the case every year. And we know that China subsidizes the production of 99% of those inputs. Okay, so in the case of China, you can think of it as all covered by subsidies. So because we don't have this product variation within China, we also look at another form of industrial policy in China, which is the Made in China 2025, which is an industrial policy they came up with in 2015, planning ahead for the next 10 years. And they targeted specific sectors. And they targeted about 50% of all the products included in the solar panel value chain. So if we use Made in China 2025, we have some variation in whether the products for China are extra subsidized or not, if you want. And when we look at that, we find again that within that product group, Chinese inputs are cheaper than those of other countries, but they don't make it significantly cheaper than those from China in general. Okay, so subsidies do seem to matter because they reduce the price of inputs. And that's great because everyone has access. All the firms have access to cheap Chinese inputs. Okay, so this two graphs show the distribution across firms of the share of Chinese inputs used. And you see that for a large number of firms, whether they're Chinese FDI or not, most of the firms, 100% of their inputs are from China. There is no differences in use of cheap Chinese inputs, whether the firms is a Chinese FDI firm or another type of firm, domestic or FDI from another country. So what does this suggest? It suggests that all firms, domestic firms, have benefit from having access and using those subsidized cheap inputs in the production of solar panels in Vietnam. Okay. So what have we learned so far? Short recap. The first one is that Chinese FDI is a big part of solar production in Vietnam. And so this is in line with what other authors have called relocation with Chinese characteristics. So it's the idea that yes, the US and other countries maybe import less from China now, import more from other countries, including Vietnam, including Thailand, including Mexico. But a lot of these imports still involve China. And they involve one way in which they involve China is that it's Chinese FDI firms that are exporting those products, even if they're based in other countries. Another way in which you have this relocation with Chinese characteristics is that those exports, even if they're not done by Chinese FDI firms, they embed Chinese value added. So Chinese parts and components here dominate the supply chain. They're all subsidized in China and they're cheaper than products from inputs from other countries. And so we find when we focus on Chinese inputs specifically, they're 49% cheaper than those from other countries, the exact same 8-digit product. The third fact is that it's not just Chinese FDI firms based in Vietnam that benefit from access to those Chinese parts and components. It's also Vietnamese firm, local firm. They all have they all use the same share of Chinese inputs. And we think this is important because previous research has shown that subsidies in upstream industries or subsidies of inputs, it enhances downstream export performance. And so the idea that having access to cheap Chinese inputs has allowed Vietnamese firms to export uh, to the US. Another fact that we've established is that domestic content has increased over time. We saw the number of Vietnamese firms going up, and we saw the share of inputs coming from Vietnam also increasing over time. So this is an important point also that comes up in this literature is the idea that when you have relocation from China, maybe it's just transshipment. They're just using Chinese firms or just using Vietnam to pretend that they're exporting from another country, but it's really just Chinese companies. Maybe they do minimal assembly. The rise of in the share of Vietnamese content suggests that it's more than just transshipment. There is some production going on in Vietnam that involves a lot of raw materials and parts and components. It's not just the import of unassembled solar panels being assembled and shipped to the US. All right, we're at step 4. Next, final step of this presentation. What about FDI spillovers? So there's a large literature that suggests that in developing countries, FDI has all kinds of benefits for local firms. So it creates jobs, high-paying jobs. It creates links with domestic companies. It increases their productivity, technology transfer, etc. So we want to investigate this type of FDI spillover in this setting. More specifically, do local suppliers, so the Vietnamese firms based in Vietnam that supply parts and components to FDI firms, um, how well are they doing thanks to Chinese FDI? Did they create jobs? Did the supplying to a Chinese FDI firm increase their productivity? Yes or no? Okay, so the first thing that we do, we look at around 400 firms that we identified in Vietnam uh, that supply inputs to solar panel producers. Okay, so this shows a map from 2016 to 2022 based on the VS data. So this is the cluster in the north of Vietnam, close to Hanoi. It shows how many firms supplying parts and components to solar panel producers, how it has grown over time, and how many jobs it accounts for. Suggests that we have more than 50,000 jobs in those firms, local firms supplying solar panel firms, parts and components in Vietnam. Okay, so the number of local suppliers was about 200 in 2016 and has almost doubled in 2022. We have two columns. So we have firms that have a link with Chinese FDI, so that supply parts and components to Chinese FDI firms making solar panels in Vietnam, or firms that supply to other FDI or to domestic Vietnamese solar panel makers. And so you see that it's grown a lot until 2020 and has more or less the number of firms has been stable since then. And we see the same pattern when we look at job numbers. So it has grown from 2016 to 2020, then has stayed quite high since then. So you have about 10,000 jobs in firms that supply Chinese FDI firms, and you have about 25,000 jobs in firms that supply other solar panel manufacturers. Okay, so we're going to compare those two groups. Okay, firms that supply or that start supplying to Chinese FDI to solar panel input suppliers that supply to other types of firms to see if there are something special happens when you supply Chinese FDI. Okay. So why do we look at that? Because there are some papers that suggest that supplying inputs or starting a relationship or joining a global value chain. When you start supplying to an FDI firms, you see employment growth, you see productivity gains. Okay, we see this in the case of Costa Rica and in the case of Belgium. Or do we also see this in the case of solar panels in Vietnam? That's what we try to answer. And so to answer this question, we estimate a diff and diff model or an event study specification. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you have the outcome variable, so whether employment, sales, productivity, or wages of firm I in year T. And then our variable of interest is whether it starts supplying a Chinese FDI firms. So all the sample here comprises of solar panel input suppliers. So we compare those that start supplying to Chinese firms to those who are never treated, so that never supply to Chinese FDI, and those who will be treated in the future. So we have data from 2018 to 2023. So the first time we can think of a new link being established is in 2019. Okay, and then we include firm and year fixed effect. So it's a two-way fixed effect diff and diff specification. Because the treatment is staggered, we're going to estimate it with a new diff and diff estimator, so Sun and Abraham and Callaway and Santana. And we also use a synthetic diff and diff, and that helps us use weights to balance the pre-trend. Make sure the pre-trend that there's no pre-trend. So the main result that we have is that when firms start supplying to Chinese FDI firms, they see increases in labor productivity. So you see it at time zero, the year they start supplying, you see it in the year after, 2 years after, 3 years after. Overall, the average treatment effect is 33%. Okay, so firms that start supplying to Chinese FDI compared to firms that continue to only supply to domestic or other FDI firms, non-Chinese, they see, so those who start supplying to Chinese FDI see increases in labor productivity. This is in line with what was found for supplying to FDI firms in general in other countries. Yeah, but suggests there are indeed upstream spillovers that local firms benefit in terms of productivity increases by joining Chinese solar value chain. When we look at sales and wages, we found positive effects that are not statistically significant. So the effect on sales, so they do sell more than those that supply to other firms, but overall, the average treatment effect is not statistically significant. When we look at wages, it's the same pattern, but we see that 3 years after, there is an effect, a positive and significant relationship. So increases in labor productivity may be also reflected in increases in wages, though the effect is not 100% or 95% statistically significant. What we don't find, however, is increases in employment. So supplying to a Chinese FDI firm doesn't seem to increase jobs in local suppliers, which is something we would have expected if you had if it allowed firms to grow bigger, more sales, more employment, create jobs. It's not what we find here. But we do find that though the firms become more productive when we measure productivity as labor productivity. And so more sales, more wages, more labor, higher productivity, but not necessarily job creation. Okay, so what did we do in this paper? We examined the rise of Vietnam's solar industry through the lens of foreign inputs, FDI, and global value chain spillovers or integration. We find that most solar inputs are from China. They're subsidized. It makes them cheaper, and that can benefit solar panel manufacturers based in Vietnam. We saw that Chinese FDI firms account for a large share of Vietnam's solar exports and employment, and they do create productivity spillovers, backward productivity spillover. Okay, so larger big thinking conclusion, by attracting FDI and important parts and components, developing countries can participate in advanced manufacturing and gain access to export markets. And at the same time, what we show here is that there is potential for cross-border effects of green subsidies. Green subsidies in China and other countries allow Vietnam to become a successful exporter of a green technology. The last conclusion, okay, the role of China in Vietnam, is it a good thing? It allowed Vietnam to become a success, export success, but there's an energy company based in Europe, EDP, that suggests that uh, solar supply chains must diversify away from China. So it opens the question as whether it's a good thing or not, this relocation or this export success with Chinese characteristics. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Pierre Louis. That was I really enjoyed that. Feel like I learned a lot. It was kind of fascinating work to get a chance to see. We do definitely have time for questions now, but 15 minutes, give or take. There were quite a few questions I got posted in the chat, some that got answered already, but I'll just kind of leave the floor open to you, Pierre Louis, to handle as people identify that they have questions, and we'll take it from there. So yes, so if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand or just I think directly speak up.
Oh, anyone wants to? What should I do? Should I start with the chat? Or should I?
Yeah, I do see. It looks like the Sung Ju just posted a question in the chat, so maybe you could start with that one.
Okay. If Chinese subsidies make Chinese solar panel inputs much cheaper than other manufacturers, shouldn't Chinese firms in China stick with Chinese inputs rather than sourcing from Vietnamese suppliers? Yeah, no, that's a great question. So maybe the share of foreign inputs is the same, but maybe the increase in the share of Vietnamese inputs comes from Vietnamese firms. I need to check that. So overall, we see an increase in Vietnamese domestic content, but I didn't check if that was driven by Chinese FDI firms or Vietnamese firms in the same way. So if you look at the whole period, there's no difference. But maybe if we look at the change over time, we will see that it is driven by Vietnamese firms. Thank you for raising this. I'll check that. Yeah, I mean, in terms of pre-trends and employment, so I mean, what we can do is to look at the synthetic result instead that weighs the control group, to create a control group with no pre-trends. And we find no difference in effects between the synthetic and the other different estimators. But it's a small time period. It's, and small sample, we only have about 400 firms in there. And so it's the best that we can do with the data, but it's not, it's, yeah.
As a follow-up question there, the like how many of the domestic suppliers that are joining, these network chains with the Chinese firms, how many of them are new domestic firms in Vietnam? And as such, if you put on sort of this restriction that, they have to have some time period ahead of time, to sort of show up in your sample that, they weren't supplying to a Chinese firm. When you look in the VES data combined with the Panjiva, how often do you see, for example, like say like a Chinese firm that locates and suppliers come with them, either domestic suppliers or foreign suppliers, and thus that partnership exists from day one, and thus they wouldn't show up in your sort of like excluded sample. I'm just curious.
Yeah, we did look at those numbers to make sure that the different model made sense. I don't remember exactly the numbers, but so we can only look at firms that existed in 2018 or 2017 or 2016, and then that joined. We only have Panjiva or supply chain data from 2018 onwards, so we have to say that those who join start supplying from to a Chinese firms, we only observe those that do so in 2019, 20, or 21. 20. So it's not the if that was the only question we were interested in, we wouldn't have exactly the best data to do that. I mean, in the case of solar panels in Vietnam, you cannot get better data, but if you wanted to answer that question in a more general way, you could do it with more products and do it better. Um, but it was a good share. We still had a few like firms that get treated in 2019 and 2020 that make it a valid estimate. Labor productivity, yeah, it's value added per worker, as in the VES data set.
Yeah, when you looked at the wage data, I'm curious. Others in the audience might know a little bit about this as well too. I've used it just a tiny little bit. I mean, there tends to be some real big noise in the wage data. Like some firms who, like in one year, they're real, low wage bill per worker firm, but then the next year they're a high wage bill per worker firm. There just seems to be a lot of reporting error in there. I'm just curious whether you guys did any sort of quick examination of that, any specific cleaning. I can't imagine that necessarily biases your results other than just introducing quite a bit of noise potentially.
In those, that's let's say subsample of firms, not the local suppliers of solar panel inputs in Vietnam. So if we have the same, let's say, variation in quality of wage data across those firms, this is something that the Meng would have better idea about because he did a lot of the data work in this paper. Mm.
Um, I don't want to monopolize asking questions. I do so have lost. Does anyone else have any questions though? I might just ask one sort of like big picture question, which I know is I feel bad because it's beyond the scope of your paper. But the last couple times that I was in Hanoi, the local government officials there are very concerned about, from their perception, the lack of spillovers, right? The lack of connectivity from foreign firms to domestic firms. Here, you seem to be showing an example of an industry where those connections are forming. They are taking off. Other industries that does not seem to have been the case, right? So like clothing and footwear. My understanding, is that the inputs from there are still very heavily sourced from outside of Vietnam, and that hasn't been changing that much. Is there something specific that you think is happening in the solar panel industry that isn't maybe happening more broadly in the various sectors that foreign firms have become such important players?
Good question. I mean, I keep on reading conflicting reports about this also in the news, right? Some people say that it's a great success story, relocation to Vietnam. Some say that, oh, it's not happening as much as people think. Um, I mean, we do see a lot of, these special economic zones booming, a lot of jobs being created overall. So, I mean, maybe it's not happening as fast as the government official would like, but there's definitely something happening in Vietnam. What is special about solar panels? I mean, maybe it's just the right level of complexity. It's not the value chain is not too complex. They can do it. They can assemble this raw material, transform these raw materials, assemble these various parts and components. It's not basic like apparel. It's not at the other end of complexity like semiconductors or so it's just the right sweet spot that allows it to have development potential, and be located in Vietnam. I don't Maybe that's it. I don't know.
Hi, I have a quick question. I think I'm picking up on some Drew's question from the chat, but I was also wondering, like, why just highlight the link with Chinese FDI for spillovers and not FDI from other firms? But if we are to think that FDI firms create spillovers. And actually, I was just wondering, is it just a size effect, as you were showing early on, how these foreign firms are just larger, not necessarily more productive, or but they're just larger in size, and so obviously they export more. Is it a size effect? Is it a specific Chinese FDI effect, or is it just an FDI effect? If you
Yeah.
can elaborate more on that, would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, we started by, I mean, one of the reasons is that we started writing the paper as the role of China in Chinese firms and Chinese parts and components in the rise of Vietnam solar panel industry. But when we also looked at whether joining supplying to FDI from another country also had created productivity spillovers, and I have them in the slides as well in the appendix. There's no effect. So it's only supplying to Chinese FDI that creates those productivity spillovers. And then we also do an estimation based on a subsample of firms that supply only to FDI firms. So we compared supplying to Chinese FDI to supplying to other FDI, and we find again a significant effect on supplying to Chinese. So there seems to be something special about supplying to Chinese FDI, even compared to FDI from other countries.
Just as a quick follow-up, are the Chinese FDI firms versus South Korean FDI firms or Japanese FDI firms, are they basically at the same stages of production and in terms of the value chain? Because I think that might potentially be important for thinking about where the spillovers come from in terms of linking with Chinese firms, but not with the other firms.
Yeah, maybe not. So um, all of those firms are selling the final product or the unassembled. That's how we selected them, and that's how we defined them at that level. Um, but all of those firms are large firms that produce other stuff as well. Mm. And so multi-product firms. And and obviously there's going to be differences, if it's FDI from South Korea or FDI from the US. They're not going to be the exact same type of firms as FDI from China, which could explain the difference. And so we didn't check that, but we should check that. FDI firms in different countries. Um, Yeah, so they're big multi-product firms. They don't just sell solar panels, final solar panels. You can check how different they are across these other dimensions.
Yeah, I think that would, in my mind, I think that'd be fascinating. It would help, I think, to sell your paper to some extent, right? Because you're really sort of talking about spillovers here, and if there's something like sort of more specific, right? Because go back to like the early motivation of your paper, right? About sort of the benefits of foreign firms. If there's something specifically that you can say, or at least maybe narrow down the possibilities about why linking with a Chinese firm compared to linking with a South Korean or Japanese firm or US firm, why one generated benefits and the others didn't would be fascinating. It would be super informative for policymakers as well too, right? Thinking about, if the South Korean firms are only linking with domestic producers who are basically just producing packaging for them, right? Then obviously you don't expect, like, say, a lot of spillovers, but then it raises the questions, okay, well, why are the South Korean firms only buying packaging from domestic firms, whereas the Chinese firms are buying important components and parts, right? It'd be super interesting to try to find out, like, to peel that back a little bit in terms of us then being able to think about when do we think spillovers are likely to happen versus not. I think it sounds like you have a great case to try to work with.
Yeah, yeah, well, definitely, it's a great suggestion, and we definitely gonna try to do more of this, try to understand how different the FDI from so different countries are, both in terms of how they supply domestically and what if the overlap of product is the same or not, let's say, the parts and components that they source, maybe they source different ones, and that would explain the different spillovers that they have. Thank you. Yeah, productivity spillovers, complementarities with other industries, definitely. Um, Electric vehicles, e-bikes, something that we could do in a follow-up extended to all green technologies. Um, yeah, I'm sure it's happening. So right now we downloaded only the data from Panjiva that is specific to solar panels, but we could extend that.
Okay, well, I know we started a bit late. We've run a bit late. Sorry again for some technical problems, but I don't see any more questions coming at this point. I'm sure Pierre-Louis and his co-authors would be happy if anyone has any additional questions they want to follow up over email. So maybe please, if we could all just take a moment to thank Pierre-Louis and his co-authors for a super interesting paper, and looking forward to seeing this paper as it moves through the process of submission, publication, etc. So thanks again, Pierre-Louis, for finding time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.